Welcome to the Ancestral Healing Summit, a free online event where you'll learn from top experts about connecting with your ancestors to heal your lineages and transform your life. Share this powerful program with your friends and family, and come join us on Facebook at The Shift Network. And now your host, Lisa Bonis.
Welcome to this session of the Ancestral Healing Summit with my guest, Rabbi Dr. Tirzah Firestone. Our topic today is healing our family legacies and changing the world. Rabbi Tirzah Firestone is a Jungian psychotherapist, author, and a spiritual leader in the International Jewish Renewal Movement. Widely known for her work on feminism and the modern applications of Jewish mystical wisdom, Tirzah teaches nationally on ancestral healing and the common boundary between ancient wisdom traditions and modern psychology. Her most recent book is titled Wounds into Wisdom, Healing Intergenerational Jewish Trauma. Tirzah, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome.
Thank you, Lisa.
All right. Well, I'm so looking forward to our conversation. But before we begin, would you like to start us out with an invocation?
Sure, I'd love to. I would love to invite all of us to arrive fully into our bodies, putting down whatever you have in your hands and just allowing your hands to be heavy and relaxed. And imagining that you put down a grounding plumb line, or you could think of a set of roots that extend down through your spinal column. And take a couple of good, very relaxed breaths. It's very important that to do this work, we're fully embodied. Super important because the work of ancestral healing is about interfacing with unseen realms. So being very grounded is key. So see that plumb line dropping through the bottom of your spine now, and I'm going to make an invocation that comes from the 1200s, from the ancient mystical Jewish text called the Zohar, that invokes our well and positive, loving ancestors and spiritual allies. Ulu ulu ushbizin ilayin karishin. Ulu ulu ushbizin ilayin karishin. Shuvu shuvu. Enter, enter, ancient guests, loving ancestors. Feel welcome to be seated among us as we open to you, as we open the channels to your healing power and wisdom. Each one of us has positive influences, positive and well ancestors. You may be wondering if anyone is out there for you right now, but we all have connections to loving influences, even if our families of origin were unwell or unloving. So please take a moment right now to invoke in your own way a positive figure who is no longer in this earth plane, who is on the other side, a loving grandmother, an uncle, maybe it's your namesake. And it may also be someone not from your bloodline, but from stories, a biblical figure, a historical figure with whom you feel a special affinity. With your next breath, just imagine yourself opening the channels to the unseen realm and really inviting a benevolent ally, or even more than one, to be here with us today. Someone who wants to help you heal and evolve so that you can transmit light in this world and clarity and hope. And if you find someone, if somebody occurs to you, and allow yourself to be surprised, please whisper their name. Name is so powerful. And if you don't know their name, just imagine, invoke someone of positive influence to come to you, to help you connect with your higher power, to connect with your divine wisdom, your better angels, so to speak. Amen.
All right, thank you. That was beautiful. I appreciate that. That's a good way to start this out. Wow, there's just so much to talk about, but let's start out with your most recent book, because this is your current work. Your book, Wounds into Wisdom. It sounds absolutely fascinating. So for those who aren't familiar with it, would you maybe tell us a little bit about your path to writing it, and maybe a little bit of your family story that led you into this?
Sure. There's a lot of amazing academic research that I did to write the book, but the book is really, in large measure, the fruit of my own personal work. It's highly autobiographical, and it is full of family stories as well as case studies and real living stories about the people and by the people with whom I worked. Like I said, my autobiography really compelled this book. I was 40 before I realized that I was really the product of a heavily traumatized system. My parents were trauma survivors. My mother was, I knew she was a German Jew. She got out of Europe in 1939 on the Kindertransport, just by the skin of her teeth. And all of her siblings made it out of Nazi Europe. However, she lost scores and scores of uncles and aunts and cousins with whom she was close. And she never mentioned any of that. It was only after my first book came out and I got a very strange call from Australia saying, "You don't know nothing about your background." And it was the one cousin who had survived and had fled a labor camp, and he told me everything. My father was an American born who was conscripted into the U.S. Army, and a kid from Brooklyn who was sent out into the most devastated parts of Germany and ended up in Bergen-Belsen in 1945 when the British were liberating that horrible death camp. And the things that he saw were unspeakable, and he never spoke of them. It was only till after he died, well after he died, that we found in his metal filing cabinet, way in the back of his office, a file folder filled with the photographs that he had taken when he was serving there, and the unseeable things that he had seen that had deeply traumatized him. And as I saw through his eyes, I realized, oh, this is why he was like this. This is why he was so dogmatic. This is why he had these outbursts. This is why mom and dad parented the way they did. Everything started to link up, and the dots started to connect. And I realized that I was the product of this unspoken trauma. And as I went into my profession as a psychologist and rabbi, working with hundreds of families, I started to see that this is so widespread. You certainly don't have to be Jewish to have a trauma lineage. I think every ethnicity has its own ruptures and tragedies. And whenever family members will die abruptly or violently or die a natural death with unfinished business, unmetabolized life issues, we know now that the residue of their extreme life traumas passes on. It's transmitted, just like a genetic code, but it's a metaphysical code that transmits to descendants and often to the most sensitive of their progeny. So we come into this world and we feel anxious or we feel afraid and we think it's us, but it's so much bigger than just our own story.
So your ancestors didn't even have to have escaped death from the actual camps. They did not have to be in them. Just having relatives who were touched by this trauma can actually then be passed through the generations.
Absolutely. So we see things, we know things, we lose people, and we don't fully understand what is happening. We're subject to injustices. Just think about the African American community, our brothers and sisters who went through or conscripted and enslaved. That lineage, you don't have to have gone through that experience, but you're just knowing that that is in your family field, and knowing that there was great suffering. For whatever ethnicity, there are these historical traumas that we go through, and that these cling to us. They make an imprint. They, as one Rachel Yehuda, traumatologist, famous traumatologist, says, they leave their evidence on our genetic code. So they, it's not within, they don't change the genetic code, but they leave evidence and like an imprint upon the genetic code that influences gene expression. So how are we with anxiety, and how do we bounce back? How resilient are we from our own stresses in life? All of that's determined by what happened in the generations above us.
Right, right. Yeah, we're talking about epigenetics here, how those things can actually change the expression of our genes. And so while we're on the topic of epigenetics, would you like to give us maybe an example or a story of how trauma actually
Sure.
transfers through the generations?
Yes, I spoke with one young woman, a young millennial who told me that she had a recurring nightmare from it's her first memory in life. And it wasn't until she was 3 or 4 that she could describe the story she was seeing every night, or many nights, that woke her up in the middle of the night and agonized her. So when she was 3 or 4, her mother would rush into her room and sit her in the rocker and comfort her. She had a wonderful mother. And finally, this woman told the story, this young girl told the story, that she saw herself circling around an old town, and she would come to the train station. Everything was wood. She would see a man jump from the platform into the train tracks, running after a train that was just taking off, and running, very upset and crying and yelling after the train. And he could never catch up with the train, of course. And that's when she would wake up, and she would be agonized and would be crying and feeling all of his pain. Well, finally, when she told her mother that story, her mother burst out crying and said, "How could you know? How could you know? This is the exact story of your grandfather. In World War II, he had come home after bartering food on the black market, finding his apartment door open, his family gone. The Gentile neighbors saying, oh, they were all just taken down. All the Jewish neighbors were just taken down to the train station, and there, that is exactly what happened. He jumped into the tracks and ran after his family, who were on the train and never caught up. Her mother was the second family, and this grandfather was already dead. But somehow, this next generation, granddaughter, had been imprinted with this wildly painful experience. So we see that we don't have any research data on how it is that nightmares transfer, but we do know that huge stresses and the residue of huge stress and extreme life traumas do transfer into the next generations. And so this young woman was very savvy, and she got together with a group of other third generation survivors, and they told their stories. And interestingly enough, she said, oh, my story is not unusual at all. We all dreamed our grandparents' horror dreams. So this is a way that we, even in the epigenetic labs and the clinical studies, we don't have all the information yet, but we are, and that's really why we're talking about this so much now, is because we do have enough information, we do have enough data and evidence to know that there is a that environmental stresses are heritable. They are inherited.
Right. Wow. That is such an incredible story. Thank you so much for sharing that. I don't know how you did that without tearing up, because I sure did. So then let's talk again, either about this woman or perhaps somebody else who has a similar story. How can you take something like this and actually begin to heal? How do you connect with ancestors? What's the process that you've learned?
Great question. I think doing our personal work, understanding where we come from, understanding what our legacy is, both our positive resources, every family, no matter how neurotic, like mine, every family has positive riches and positive resources that we can glean to know what our legacy is so we can energize the positive, and also know what our historical traumas and ruptures are in our background. What did our parents live through? What did especially our grandparents and great-grandparents live through? Were they immigrants? Were they just displaced? Did they suffer discrimination, racial or religious or otherwise? Did somebody lose a child or die in childbirth? Was there a painful divorce, or was somebody cut off in the family? One young woman told me a story of her finally finding out that her grandmother was raped on the boat over to Ellis Island just before coming into Ellis Island, and that, of course, that was never spoken of. And she found out in a very obscure way, but the script, the injunction in that family was so tight because it had so much fear around the feminine, and that's what she had. That's what her legacy was passed down to her. So there's always something in our the backstory. So we want to find out as much as we can, and start doing our personal transformation work. I'll tell you another story of a woman I worked from. This time, a woman from Iran, who was a young woman. Also, she was in her late 30s, and she was a very vivacious woman. I call her Esty in the book. And Esty had only one problem, and that was she had a 7-year-old daughter named Shiraz, who had an extreme anxiety disorder. She was a separation anxiety disorder. She couldn't be away from her parents. She couldn't go to school. She couldn't have play dates. She was a kid that was just in huge fear of saying goodbye. And so Esty came to me just to get some support. And in our work, we did what we call a genogram. We did a 3-dimensional family tree to see, let's look at what happened in your family that may have a bearing on your little daughter. And we found that she told me very proudly how her parents had escaped Tehran. They were very wealthy. They left with a shopping bag full of things, closed up their mansion, rode out of Tehran in the middle of the night with really nothing in a donkey cart, wobbling around on opium bundles, crossed the border into Pakistan, bribed the guards this way, bribed the guards that way, got on a plane and found their way to Switzerland and then Miami. And it was a success story. Her mother actually was pregnant with Esty at the time. And I said, that's such a wonderful legend. You must be so proud of it. But what about this other side of the family? Here on the family tree, what do you know about them? And she didn't know anything. And that night called me greatly distressed because she had turned over a family secret in all of her asking and inquiries. Her parents were very ashamed and very, very upset that she had inquired about this family because a terrible family secret had been unearthed, and that was that they had left a blind and very elderly grandmother in Tehran who was very vociferous and would have sounded all the alarms had she, and couldn't have gone left on the opium bundle donkey cart. And they didn't tell her where they were going, and they never said goodbye. They just closed the door and left town. And here her daughter-in-law was pregnant, and that was it. Her life force just waned. She died shortly thereafter, and They had enormous shame about this. So I'm telling this whole story to say that Esty was livid. What do you mean? That's not the kind of people we are. We're going to get all the pictures out. We're going to have a memorial for her. And she yelled and railed at her parents. How could you do such a thing without much forgiveness? But in the chaos and pandemonium of turning over that stone and feeling the grief and doing a great big memorial service for this grandmother she had never met, all of that was her personal work. But what about in the other side of the family and the other side of the house was this little 7-year-old girl who was mysteriously getting better and better, mysteriously started within a couple of weeks saying, why am I not in school? Let me get out of here. I want to go to school. I'm 7. I want play dates. Where are my friends? And she had this mysterious acausal, it's seemingly acausal healing. And it turned out that over thousands of miles and 3 generations, this little girl had absorbed a kind of separation anxiety, a trauma about goodbye. And when it started to get, the secret started to come out and the shame was dispelled, this little girl somehow, synchronistically, started to heal. So when we do our healing work, whatever it is, when we start to turn over the stones in our families and learn about it and feel the feelings and give dignity to those ancestors who have been disconnected and separated, mysterious things start to happen. Sometimes in other parts of the family, sometimes we get a letter, sometimes there's a spontaneous healing. We don't know what's going to happen, but it's all for the better.
Well, you've got the most amazing stories. Wow. Now, so many questions are popping to mind, but first, what if you never learn the actual stories? Like for people who are adopted, I always ask this question, but even for this specific family, if the story had never come out about the grandmother and all of this work to connect with her spirit on the other side, etc., how do you approach that kind of thing?
It's a very good question, Lisa. A lot of times, from my background, many people had so many people lost, so many people perished. Their genograms, their family trees are just filled with question marks. And it's really a matter of following a thread, sometimes very, very thin threads, that I have this anxiety disorder, or I have this fear, phobia, and I just pull the thread until I find more. Or another way to say it is just put your ear to the ground. Sometimes asking, opening, doing the invocation that we did earlier on, to say, I, with so much respect and with so much honor, I opened this ancestral door and I invoke ancestors who may not be named to me, may not have their history. I may actually go on genie.com or ancestry.com and look up my family tree, and there you will start to see amazing things. It may be that you take a trip to the Czech Republic or to Ireland or to a place that you can start to drink the water and smell the fragrances of the air and walk the land where you know your ancestors walked. I've heard so many stories of people who have opened those the doors to the ancestral plane in different ways. I think intention is everything. And getting help, I do believe, and this is, we talked about the unseen realms. I do believe that when we have our allies present, and very, very important that when we embark on this work, we all have well and healthy and loving ancestors, whether it's a namesake or it could be Martin Luther King Jr. or Mother Teresa, or it could be historical figures or uncles, aunts, people that are benevolent, and ask for help. Ask for them to be an intercessor, to help on our behalf, to find out what is my riddle, what is the riddle of my family, of all this information that I do not know. Things start to happen. Very mysterious.
Right. Going back again to what you were talking about previously, where the woman discovered that her grandmother had been raped on her way over. One of my family lineages, those who are doing the work will be familiar with the fact that you start out with your mother's line, your mother's father's line, your father's father's line, your father's mother's line. So that's where you begin. And in one of those lineages, I haven't been able to get very far because I sense this incredible trauma, and it feels like there was that kind of thing, that kind of storyline of really traumatic rape. And I know I'm not the only woman. You know that this is a really common theme. So if you don't mind, let's dive into that. How does one begin to address something so very traumatic and so very widespread? Whether this is a Jewish story or not, this is a woman's story.
That's right.
How do you work
That's
with
right. I had a huge honor. As soon as my book came out in April, I was able to, I was so honored to hear from Gloria Steinem. And Gloria wanted to champion this book. And I think it was because of this, the profound legacy, trauma legacy that most women, if not all women, have. Some variation thereof of being denigrated or exploited or disrespected. And so to bring the riches from this era, when we know better, when we are sanctioned to reclaim our dignity and reclaim our self-respect and know that there are rightful boundaries, understand the heinous residue of the patriarchy, which is just beginning to get called out. I think we're just at the very beginning with the Me Too movement to call out these sort of nefarious aftermath of the patriarchal rights of men in the West. Anyway, we don't even know about other parts of the world as much, but to do the work of opening the ancestral door, opening the ancestral plane, and bowing. And if you know anyone, you certainly may know about your ancestor, or may know her name, or your, let's say, your maternal grandmother or your paternal grandmother, calling her by name in a ceremony. I do this in a ceremonial way, in a ritual way, with a candle, with having her picture out, really making an offering, and doing this in a way that is very, very respectful. And facing her, as it were, dignifying her, calling her by name, thanking her for her life, speaking, verbalizing the fact that you may have experienced this. I don't know the facts of your life, but I do know that you lived in a male culture, male-dominated culture, and I want to thank you for what you went through on my behalf. And I want you to know that I respect you, and I ask you, I dignify my grandmother with a request for her to step into her power now and to illuminate my life with her wisdom. So when we face directly, one-on-one, that's my own lineage of ancestral healing, is doing this work in a ritual way, facing and speaking to, and then also listening for the wisdom and listening for any response. There is tremendous glow that happens just by, like I said, dignifying the other and paying respect and acknowledging what they've been through, even if it's just it's just circumspecting that you have gone through something. I'm just suspect that has happened, and I am calling you into your full power.
Okay. And then with this type of work specifically, this is just off the top of my head, it seems like the things that might be healed of this are guilt, she was asking for it, wrong place at the wrong time, all of these things that I think women in general sort of feel about being a female in this world. What sort of healing work have you seen in your experience by approaching this topic?
Well, I think, Lisa, it's so important to learn and identify the hallmarks of trauma. So because we're all harboring the residue of trauma, whether it's intergenerational trauma or in my own life that I myself am suffering from a boundary crossing, for example, as a woman. So what are some of the hallmarks of trauma? I speak about this in the book, Wounds into Wisdom, and knowing them and identifying them in myself make me, just the awareness that I may have some areas in my life that I'm emotionally numb, or that I get hyper aroused and I am very hyper reactive. Like I go from 0 to 10 in reactivity and things trigger me. And what are those things? So doing these self-studies. The next one I discuss at length is shame and the tendency to isolate because of shame. That is a trauma residue. That is the residue of trauma, and it's a hallmark of trauma, whether it's personal trauma or intergenerational trauma or collective trauma. All entire ethnicities can feel these hallmarks. So we have emotional numbness, we have hyperreactivity, we have this tendency to shame, to feeling shame, and tendency to isolate ourselves. And then we have this very quizzical one, the inadvertent tendency to recreate the conditions of my own injury again and again, either on myself or on somebody else. So because I have a blind spot, because we dissociate around our trauma, we go a little bit blank because it's too much and too much to bear. We tend to have little blind spots. So we tend inadvertently, unconsciously to recreate the conditions for trauma. So that's why we have such high statistics of children that have been neglected or abused tend to recreate that with their children unless they have awareness. And awareness is everything in this work. Awareness is really the key. So learning and identifying the hallmarks of trauma are really important so that we know when we're in a trauma response, or we know that we have inherited the residue of an ancestor's trauma. That's part of the work as I see it.
Okay. All right. So then you feel that connecting with the female lineage, the grandmothers in our background can help to clear up this this energetic muck.
This, I think, is so important. It's our grandmothers and our great grandmothers, and also understanding that they didn't know what we know now. They didn't have the permissions that we have now, and so giving honor to them and asking for their wisdom, asking for them to guide our lives with their health. It's really important also, Lisa, that we distinguish between ancestors who are well and beneficent and benevolent and helpful and full of vivaciousness, and those who are not well, and those who are, they have gotten in some way crimped or compromised. And we develop, as we do this work, we develop a sensitivity to the difference between those two. So calling in positive and energetic and loving, helpful ancestors first, and always beginning the work with that, and then with them around us and listening to them and dialoguing with them. And then there will be those who we find in our lineage, people whose lives have been cut short, those who died in childbirth or who were the victims of terrible abuses. And we are then in the position, once we are flanked by our guides, to give honor and help these less well ancestors become well through dignity and honor, and also doing the work of untangling their traumas and ruptures. I do that in a very different way. My lineage is different than Daniel For's, who is also a wonderful teacher in the community. I hail from another lineage, Jill Peirce from England, and my training is about doing ceremonial or shamanic family constellations, and and ritual dyad work. So we'll do much of that hopefully in the classes to come.
Right. Wow. Well, thank you for allowing me to go off on that tangent, because I think that's a really important topic that we haven't addressed in any of these conversations. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Now, before we go any further in the conversation, I want to make sure that I mention your website so people who are piqued by what we're saying here. It's tirzahfirestone.com, and let me spell that Tirzah Firestone.com. And is that the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Sure. That's fine. And there's my schedule is on there, and you can contact me easily through that.
Okay, terrific. So we're running low on time, but before we close, do you maybe have any final suggestions for our viewers if they want to make changes in their own lives? I know you've offered many. Are there any that we've left out?
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you. We'll do a little wrap up. I think not to be afraid to dig deep, to know that we are getting help. This is a critical time in world history. I don't only believe, I know, I sense that there are positive guides, ancestral allies, and all kinds of ancestral help on the other side. We need to learn how to open the channels, open the valves, so that we can receive that good guidance and divine wisdom from the other side. Learning about ourselves and our families more. Identifying our own trauma triggers and what we might have inherited. I think that there's one more, because it's such a critical time in our world right now, and there's so many crises brewing. I would like to quote a teacher of mine, Andrew Harvey, who said, "Follow your heartbreak. Don't follow your bliss. That's fine too. And we all must do that," what Joseph Campbell said. He said, but today in our world, follow your heartbreak, so that we can, and do your personal work so that you're freed up to apply your health and vivaciousness and energy and activate transformation in the world in a place that really you feel about strongly. So this might be working with women, and it might be working for animals, and it might be other environmental issues, or it might be down at the border. Where does your heart break? And then from a place of personal self-compassion and a place of awareness, self-awareness, we have the freedom, we have the energy, and we have the motivation to help out in the world.
All right, so before we go, is there anything that we've left out that you want to make sure that we talk about?
Thanks for that, Lisa. I think that I would just underscore that each and every one of us has so much power to heal our own lives, but more, also heal, untie the knots and solve the riddles, and really heal the trauma legacy that is in our bloodlines. And I'll tell you a quick story. This past summer, I met two gentlemen who are very involved in healing their trauma legacies. They are the descendants of two different families who were cavalry, involved at a very high level of the cavalry officials back in the 1800s, who called the massacre at Wounded Knee. And the Native Americans who perished there was many of you know, it was a horrible bloodbath. And these two gentlemen did not know each other, but they were both feeling the weight of their family history, and independent of one another, before they ever met, they felt that there was a karmic onus, a burden upon themselves that they could not live with. They felt this enormous guilt. And they began making contact, first studying their own legacies, understanding what their grandfathers had done and the massacres that they had initiated upon our indigenous tribes. And then they started making overtures to the tribes, and they have done immense rituals of healing and reconciliation that I took part in this summer, the last day of a Sundance here in New Mexico, which was given to the healing of these terrible crimes that had been done. So there were the elders who were children at the massacre present, and there were the descendants of the cavalrymen who had done these terrible acts, and they were in a ritual format, forgiving and telling the stories and forgiving one another. That was a beautiful, beautiful example of the power we have to honor our ancestors by saying this is wrong. We must undo these knots. We must tell these stories and take full ownership and heal what has been done. And so they themselves tell incredible healing stories about the liberation that they feel and that their children feel, and that obviously that is felt on the part of the indigenous peoples who had suffered so greatly. That's one story among many others.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm glad I asked if there was anything else. We are out of time. So once again, thank you so much for being
Thank you so much, Lisa.
Thank you once again, Rabbi Tirzah Firestone, and thank you to everyone for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this conversation in the Ancestral Healing Summit.
Thank you for joining the Ancestral Healing Summit, brought to you by the Shift Network. To learn more, visit ancestralhealingsummit.com. To learn more about our global programs to support you in waking up in all the areas of your life and taking inspired action, visit theshiftnetwork.com. Thank you again for joining us and for sharing this empowering path of healing your lineages with your friends and family.